Hello and welcome to another Tattered Cover virtual event series. My name is Adam and I am the Director of Events at Tattered Cover. And we have plenty of virtual events coming up. So if you're interested, please go to tatteredcover.com/event. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram where we tweet out and post about all of our upcoming events. If you need closed captioning tonight, there is a black bar at the bottom of your YouTube screen that says CC, or there's a button that says CC. Please click that and you can get closed captioning for anyone who wants or needs it. Tonight, we have a very special guest who wrote a book called Water, a Biography. It is by Giulio Boccaletti. He is a globally recognized expert on natural resource security and environmental sustainability. He is an honorary research associate at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, Oxford University. Trained as a physicist and climate scientist, he holds a doctorate from Princeton University, where he was a NASA Earth Systems Science Fellow. He has been a research scientist at MIT and was a partner at McKinsey & Company, where he was one of the leaders of its sustainability and research productivity practice and a chief strategy officer and global ambassador for water at the Nature Conservancy, one of the world's largest environmental organizations. His work on water has been featured in the PBS documentary series, H2O, The Molecule That Made Us. He currently lives in London. So if you're here in Denver with us, you understand London is at midnight. So thank you so much. Giulio Boccaletti, please join us. We will have this great virtual conversation about your book.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us at midnight your time.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure, Adam.
And before we were recording, we were talking about your book. And I just want to hear, what is water from your perspective? Because someone like me may not understand what Water Biography is all about. What is it about from your perspective?
Sure. Well, it may be helpful, Adam, if I just kind of give a little background on this book, because I worked on water security for many years. And what that meant is that I sort of went around the world trying to help countries make sure that they had enough water when they needed and they weren't overwhelmed by floods when there was too much and so forth and so on. So it was in a way, a fairly technical kind of view of the world. But as I did that work, I came to realize that water is much more than a sort of scientific or technical subject, that, the relationship that people and societies have with their water environments really goes at the heart of their identity. And this is not going to be all that hard to understand for those of you who live in the Western United States. You're currently, if you're in the Colorado Basin or you're dependent on the Colorado Basin, for example, you'll know that there's something very sort of profound about the relationship between the people that live in the 7 riparian states and this kind of trickle of a river at this point that, however, sustains all of this economy. And so to me, water is, of course, a substance, is an important sort of molecule on the planet, but it's also what I came to realize is that water is the agent of the climate system on the landscape, right? So through the floods and droughts, through the way in which water is distributed on the landscape, the climate system affects its agency on the landscape. And so it's the principal natural counterpart to us. We became sedentary about 10,000 years ago. You could say we decided to stand still in a world of moving water. And ever since that moment, we've had this kind of relationship with this agent, this substance that shapes the landscape around us and against which we fight and which we also have to harness and depend on. And so to me, water is this kind of companion that's been traveling along our history with us for 10,000 years. And the last thing I'll say, Adam, by the way, at midnight, I get quite lengthy because, but the last thing I'll say is that, I wanted to write a biography because it's really a story about us. It's a story about us and our relationship as a society or as societies with this substance. So the book is that story. It's the story of us over time and our relationship with this powerful agent of the environment.
I want to start with your background a little bit because your bio is very lengthy and it's really impressive. Why water? Like you mentioned, this book came about because of the work you were doing, but how did you get to that point in your life that became your focus?
Well, so Adam, I started out as a climate scientist. I was a physicist, and then I worked on climate issues as a theoretician primarily for a number of years. And at some point, I had this minor revelation, as one does in one's sort of late 20s, and I wanted to have an impact on the world. I decided I wanted to leave academia and kind of try my hand at not just writing papers, but doing something in the world. And I was convinced at the time that I would just appear on the world stage and talk about climate and everybody would sort of listen. And this was the early 2000s. It was a very different environment from the one that we live in today, where everybody seems to be at least aware of climate issues. And so I went into business and I tried talking about climate and climate issues and carbon emissions and the likes, and I didn't get much traction. But then I realized that, talking about water instead was of great interest to companies, to governments who had very practical, very present, and very real problems in managing their operations and making choices in the face of, potential scarcity, in the face of destructive droughts, in the face of storms. And from where I was sitting as a climate scientist, water and climate are sort of two faces of the same coin. Water is the way in which the climate expresses itself. It's just one of the ways in which we know what the climate system is doing. So the two things are, in many ways inseparable. In fact, one is part of the other. But for whatever reason at the time, we're almost talking 15, 20 years ago, the lens of water was a much more accessible lens for companies and decision makers to think about the environment. And so I sort of started thinking about it that way. And then as I developed my work and my practice and I started traveling the world, I came to realize that our relationship with water is much more than that. It's a platform for development. I worked a lot in a number of developing countries, and I came to realize that countries succeed or fail on the back of their ability to essentially deliver water security to their economies, making sure that there's enough water to grow food, enough water to produce power, whilst at the same time ensuring that people are not subjected to destructive floods. That skill, the ability of a country, of a state to deliver water security, is one of the key determinants of developmental success. And so that's how I got into water. I was, first interested in talking about climate change, and then as I kind of developed my work, I got more and more interested in the question of development and poverty alleviation and the likes, and I came to realize that water plays a fundamental role in kind of ensuring that countries succeed. And then that brought me sort of to everything that I did after.
With developing countries and succeeding or failing based on water, what are some key components of successes? What makes a country successful with getting water to their economy and civilization?
Well, again, if you think about the West of the United States, that's a good archetype. And in many ways, and in the book, I spent a fair amount of time. The book starts back in sort of the early Sumerian period, so 5,000 years before Christ, and then travel all the way to the present. But as you get towards the sort of third part of the book, America and the Western United States in particular plays a really important role in the story. In fact, the whole world looks like it does because of the West of the United States, and maybe we'll get back to that point later. But the Western United States is a really good kind of archetype to think about answering your questions. How does water actually? What is it that actually people do that delivers kind of success or failure? Because if you think about, John Wesley Powell showing up, in the second half of the 19th century, traveling around the West, and asking the question, well, what would it take to succeed here for essentially people of European heritage who are used to cultivating crops in, Eastern Europe? Like, what would it take to be able to colonize the West of the United States and survive and thrive? And he realized that, there was the need for very significant intervention on the part of the federal state, that you would need to, the southwest of the US, for example, was essentially uninhabitable as far as he was concerned. We're talking about the 1870s and 80s, unless somebody came along and and actually started building infrastructure and capturing water so that there would be some when none come from the sky, and that floods could be managed and so forth and so on. Now, by the time you get to the beginning of the 20th century, a city like San Diego would have had 10,000 people in it, and the West was still largely uninhabited. And then in the span of about 40 years, the federal government of the United States essentially replumbed the West, right? So the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers came in and transformed the landscape. Now, for better or for worse, but it was entirely transformed. So that, at the beginning of the century, at the beginning of the 20th century, a farmer living on the landscape in the West would not have been any more secure than a farmer in the 12th century, pretty much. By the time you get to the 1950s and 60s, you could almost turn off the tap from the sky, and things could keep going for a couple of years without anybody noticing. Right? That was a complete dramatic replumbing of the planet. And arguably, and I do argue this in the book, in many ways, it's not just that because America was rich, it was able to do that, but America became rich because it did that. And so this ability to control the landscape was instrumental in providing a platform for the agricultural development of California. There's the story of the Imperial Valley and so forth and so on. But then it also became fundamental in providing cheap power for industrialization. If you remember that during the Progressive era and the sort of New Deal era, the primary technology for the delivery of power, of electricity, was hydropower. There were, the big boilers that we're now accustomed to, that go into the thermal power plants, didn't exist until the 1950s. They weren't big enough. And so the sort of workhorse of industrialization in the first half of the 20th century was hydroelectric power. That's why Hoover Dam was so important, for example. And so rivers in the first in progressive America, New Deal America, became the blueprints for the industrialization of the country. And so you have storage built to protect agriculture from scarcity and floods. You have hydroelectric power that delivers cheap electricity for industrialization. You have large infrastructure that controls waters and so forth and so on. So these are all the levers that a state pulls in order to deliver that security. What does it need in order to be able to do that? Well, it needs many things, but two that are important. One is enormous underwriting capability. In other words, you have to have a strong currency and an economy that's able to underwrite the cost of building all this stuff. And then you need institutions that are capable of exercising sovereignty over the landscape. All this replumbing is an enormous and powerful and disruptive act of sovereignty over the landscape of the West. It required a powerful state. And part of the story I tell in the book is how, the 20th century became a century of hydraulic states, of states that were sort of whose power was largely expressed through their ability to transform the landscape for the purposes of managing water. And so those are sort of the levers that a state uses, and the West is a very, it's almost the archetype of how this happened. I'll just close by saying, Adam, that one of the things that's really interesting about where we are today, and you'll have seen this if you just moved to the West, but you will have seen this last summer, the significant droughts that have happened and fires in the far West, and then of course the floods in New York and other places, is that those extraordinary solutions that transformed the West in the 20th century and transformed the world over the course of the 20th century are starting to creak under their age. The solutions that worked for a world of 2-3 billion people are starting to fail for a world of 7 billion people. And so we're at a really interesting time for water, because we thought we had solved it, and it turns out we haven't.
So what do countries like America especially, what do we need to do now to ensure the future relationship with water?
Yeah. Well, part of the reason for writing this book was to try and extract water from the depths of sort of technical obscurity. Right. Part of the problem with these things is that you start talking about water, and very quickly you're talking about engineering and dams, and soon enough somebody who doesn't have a technical background will think, well, what do I know? Somebody needs to decide for me. How could I possibly? And the reality is that what I try to point out in the book is that the issues that we faced and we have faced for 10,000 years haven't fundamentally changed, and they're fundamentally political issues. They're essentially the starting point for any decision about water. Starting point for any decision about water are questions about what do we want our home to look like, who do we want to have living in it, and how, right? What does our life look like? That's a very human political question. It's not a technical question. You can't ask a scientist to answer that question. We have to have a collective view as to what we want our landscape and our homes to look like. And so if there's a kind of fundamental insight that I try to convey in telling this story, is that the story of water is not the story of engineering. It's the story of political institutions and the choices that we made as societies about that very simple question: what do we want us, our landscape and our life to look like? And so one of the concerns I have, and one of the reasons I wanted to tell the story and try and kind of reveal this insight, is that for the last 60, 70 years, because of the dramatic success in delivering water security to everybody, you and I don't wade a stream on our way to work every day. That's unusual in the history of humanity, But the fact that we don't have to do that means that we don't think about water all that often, which is also unusual, which means that people just assume that somebody will take care of it. And in doing so, they delegate enormous power to somebody without much oversight. And so to solve some of the issues that we have ahead of us, the first most important step is that water and these fundamental questions about what the landscape needs to look like need to rise up the totem pole of political discourse and get at the heart of public debate. You can't solve the problem of water in the West with having some collective understanding of whether or not these are really agricultural landscapes and what the agricultural communities are going to do in that landscape. That's a collective problem. It's not just an individual question. And so the first step, the first answer to your question, what do we do now? How do we solve it? Is, well, we all need to start a lot more. We need to start talking a lot more about what our natural landscape and what our environment should be. And then you have a bunch of options and a bunch of choices. But the choice is not just technical; they're also ethical and moral. For example, we might decide that we have to come to accept a greater level of variability. Maybe that security that we thought existed, that ensured that water was behind the walls of a dam and we never had to worry about it, maybe that's not the right answer anymore. Maybe we have to learn how to live with a more variable environment, with water being much closer to our doorstep. And how to do that in a way that's safe is an interesting question, but it's one that's solvable once you know that's the picture you want, as opposed to everybody have their feet dry because we all have cement around us and we don't have to worry about rivers. The book is not prescriptive in, I don't have recommendations for what people ought to do, and I don't use moral language, but I do think that, our story and our values are the starting point for the conversation about what comes next.
As you were talking, part of my brain, it went to the countries you were working with and to make sure water is safe and accessible and everything. I guess, what percentage of the world is where you feel it needs to be with water? That's a very broad question, but are there still countries that are just, they're nowhere near where they need to be to have water to get to their economy?
So there's the answer sort of splits into two parts. Water is both infrastructure for economic and social development. So we collect it to provide food, we protect ourselves from floods, we have levees, dams, the big infrastructure, big water story. And then there's the narrower but really important problem of ensuring that people have access to safe drinking water, right? So water and sanitation problems. And that's in a way a small volume problem. That's not the majority of the water use. 98+% of the water use on the planet is agricultural. But, the small slice that's related to delivering safe drinking water to people is from a human perspective and human cost perspective, is a very, very important part of the story. So how many people are sort of water secure? It maps almost entirely on wealth. So most developed countries, for a variety of reasons, some of them have to do with the fact that they are wealthy, and some of it has to do with the fact that they have very benign hydrology. The combination of these two factors means that, probably a fifth of the world is effectively water secure. Now, that's the world in which New Orleans happened, in which New York happened, in which the fires happened, right? So you're water secure until something happens, right? And one of the things I would say is that there was a time, even maybe just 10 years ago, when people thought that that high level of security that had been achieved by about a fifth of the population of the world was total control of the environment. And we're now discovering that that's not true, right? The climate system is changing enough that our water environment is changing and our infrastructure and institutions are failing. But that's the sort of, the pinnacle, if you will, of that particular form of water security. The rest of the world is at various stages of, water insecurity. There are, about 800 million people on the planet. 800 million people, that's 2.5 times the population of the United States, that have no access to clean water sanitation. The statistics are kind of daunting when you start thinking about it. I mean, a million kids die every year of, essentially waterborne diseases. Dysentery is one of the leading causes of death. So, I mean, there's that sort of lower bottom quintile, essentially, that's really subject to the terrible curse of not having any water security. And then sort of 3/5 of the world is somewhere in between, right? But the thing is that the picture that America painted in the first half of the 20th century of what water security actually looks like, right? The building of Hoover Dam and the building of, the American Canal and the reclamation works in the Tennessee Valley and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those created the blueprint for everybody in the world to imagine what water security should be. So everybody in that hierarchy, from the people that are most water secure to the people who are most water insecure today, if we do nothing, are essentially all pointing in the same direction. They're all trying to get to where California got to, 50, 60 years ago. I worked in Ethiopia for many years, and, the difference is striking. If you are in America, the per capita storage capacity is about 4,000 cubic meters. That's 4,000 bathtubs every single American has to rely on, which means that you could, as I said, switch off the taps from the sky for 2 years and sort of still go, right? The average, so that's 4,000 cubic meters. The average per capita storage in Ethiopia is something like 200 cubic meters, right? So then in that context, after 2 weeks, you run out of water if it doesn't come out from the sky. And so there's a sense in which some infrastructure, some additional kind of solutions have to be implemented in places like Ethiopia. But beyond that, we all collectively in this planet have this problem of figuring out what will water security actually have to look like in the 21st century. And I don't know that we still have, I don't know that we have that answer yet.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question about what is next. I mean, I already kind of asked that, but just the security aspect of it. You already kind of answered this, but broadly or generally speaking, what does the average person like me sitting in Denver have to worry about or have to do now? Like, what should we be doing?
Let me give you two parts to that answer. I think there's a context, and then there's so what is next? It's important to realize that the issues in water transcend the dimensions of an individual, right? So the big problem in water right now is that the torch of kind of modernism that America had for the first half of the 20th century, this idea that you could control the environment, sort of redesign it, hasn't gone away. It's just been passed on to China. In 2009, the Chinese built Three Gorges Dam. Three Gorges Dam is the Hoover Dam of the 21st century. It's 10 times the size of Hoover Dam, and it has become the new archetype, the new model for water development around the world. And so there are a number of countries around the world that are now trying to imitate the degree of engineering that the Chinese implemented on the Yangtze in order to control their water environment. In fact, if you travel across Africa, you'll find Chinese contractors with Chinese financing and Chinese plans to help a number of developing countries in Africa develop their infrastructure in their image. So I guess the reason I bring this up is that the fate of the planet and the fate of water in different parts of the planet, the fate of an individual Ethiopian asking that question that you just asked, Adam, is very much tied to the geopolitics that are kind of framing the race to Africa right now, right? So it's an eminently political problem at that level. But even if you go down to the individual question, I'm sitting in Denver, what do I do? One of the things that becomes very apparent if you look at 10,000 years of history of water is that water phenomena have scales that have to transcend the individual, right? So a scale of a storm is about 1,000 kilometers. The amount of water that comes down in a flood along the Colorado, no single individual with all of their freedom and liberty can manage the water phenomena that surround us. And in fact, the story of water is a story of collective action. Right? It's essentially a continuous story of evolution of institutions that we needed to create to manage our response to water. In fact, in the book, I argue that in many ways, the roots of democracy and even the roots of the modern republic are planted firmly in water. Right? So that you can find the DNA of water and water problems in all of the institutions that allow society to exercise its agency on the landscape. And so the problem is that we're so used to thinking as consumers in environmental issues that we always end up asking this question, what can I do? And the thing is, we're all citizens. That's what you can do, right? I mean, the first and most important thing that people can do is think of water not as just as a consumer problem, or I should just switch, not buy zucchini from a particular place, or I should turn my tap off. Of course, all of those things can be important, but they're sort of tinged of morality, whereas in fact, the most effective interventions, and the most important interventions are those that are done by the collective. And so really political engagement, I know it's a sort of an abstract and sort of old-fashioned and somewhat, unsatisfactory answer, but the fact of the matter is, this is not a consumer problem, it's a citizen problem. It's about what our political institutions decide to do on the landscape. And as citizens, we do have power and control over that. And, you can find ways of finding intermediate institutions that help you, right? Organizations that you engage with, or political parties that you engage with. But it is striking to me that for all of the discussion on climate that's kind of fashionable these days, if you look into the details of the environmental plans of political parties in the US or in Europe or in England, where I live, the roots, the proposed solutions, the sort of holistic approach to these questions that we've just been talking about, quite thin on the ground. Right? And that's because people are not paying attention. So to me, the first answer to your question, Adam, is, well, you have to pay attention. You have to make this part of your political concerns. This will be obvious to some living in the West, but I can guarantee that in most of the world, water is not at the top of the, of the sort of political concern and political discussions.
And I want to shift focus. There's a few audience questions about your work in general. But first I want to go back. How long was Water, a biography, a project for you writing it?
Well, it was a long project in a way because it sort of came out of a need, various needs. One of them was to try to make sense of what I had witnessed over the 2 decades that I've worked, more or less 2 decades that I've worked on these problems, and give some coherence to the observations that I'd made in traveling from Jordan to China to other places. But it was also a kind of a personal project in that much of my thinking about water was shaped by a fellow by the name of John Briscoe, who was the head of water at the World Bank for many years, and sort of in his latter days a professor at Harvard. And he was, some called him the water man. He was a sort of a legendary water expert. And, he passed in 2014, somewhat prematurely. And 2 weeks after he passed, I opened my laptop and started a file called Waterbook and started writing. And so that was 2015. And in a way, it was a way also for me to kind of continue conversations that we were having. So I started really writing material in 2015. But then, of course, it takes a book project and a publisher and an editor to kind of force you into making, what is a topic and a sprawling subject into a story. And that really started in 2018, and then it took me about 2 years to finish it, whilst continuing to do my day job. So it's been a long project in the making.
And then one of the questions is like, what are you working on now? What are you not book wise, just like what's your focus on in life, in your job?
Well, I'm doing several things at the same time. One of them is writing, because I have actually caught a bit of a bug, and you might understand this, Adam. You start doing this and then you start liking it, because it's also a really interesting way of thinking. And so I am working on a couple new projects that are sort of very preliminary stages, so it would be premature to talk about it. But part of the effort that part of what I tried to do with this book is to extract what is an environmental topic out of the silo environmental discussion and place it back into the mainstream of historical and political discussion. The book is quite interdisciplinary by design. It's one of the gifts of leaving academia is that you no longer have to have any particular allegiance to a discipline. That comes with some costs. I mean, it's not, but in terms of a kind of layman's book for to approach a topic like this, I think it was quite advantageous. And I want to continue to do that. I think there's a great need to extricate the environment from the jargon and from the sort of inaccessible technicism. I think, that I'm a scientist by training. I'm a big fan of science, but I think there's a little too much of trust the science. I think these are fundamentally political and human issues that need to be wrestled with in language that exceeds technical language. So part of what I spend my time doing is that, as a way of telling stories about the environment. I'm also trying to do that visually. I've worked on a few documentaries over the years, and that's another language that I'm exploring with some colleagues, and so I hope to do a bit more of that. I continue to do some work on water where I can. I mean, I continue to do some advisory work, and then the third part of my shall I use the word portfolio, Adam? Maybe I should. I'll use the word portfolio. But part of my portfolio is I also work on geospatial analytics, which sounds like an incredibly dry and scientific topic, and in some ways it is. But I and some others have started a company to use satellite imagery to try and track the state of nature from space. I'll just say one thing about that, which is we're undergoing a revolution in Earth systems monitoring. I mean, it's an extraordinary time for data about the planet. And the fundamental question for me is, how does that data become accessible to political processes so that people can make really informed decisions about their home? Because that's what it boils down to. And so I'm quite passionate about that. So if on the one side, I'm thinking about it from a sort of storytelling perspective, on the other, I'm still dabbling in sort of scientific and technical issues.
And then one thing I wanted to ask about was how did the pandemic affect water for all these kind of, like, was it, yeah.
Well, it's interesting. So the pandemic, a couple of things. One is it reminded us how important water is. One of the three things you have to do, aside from distancing and wearing masks for those that do, is washing your hands, right? In the early stages of particular pandemic. And so it's just a reminder of how important water is. And it then begs the question, what happens to those that don't have access to clean water? And in fact, that's one of the major concerns. So that's the first thing, is just the importance of I kind of just water as a solution to disease. I mean, if you look at life expectancy over the last century and a half, it pretty much tracks the access to clean water, right? It's still today the most important public health intervention on the planet, is giving people access to clean water sanitation. And so the pandemic sort of, I think, brought it once again to the fore. But the other thing that was striking to me, I actually gave a talk at Oxford a couple of months ago on this, is the parallels between the acts of sovereignty that states were able to do in the context of the pandemic. I mean, if you think about, as of, I think, I don't have the latest count, but as of June, I think, countries around the world have spent $17 trillion in kind of recovery, and they mobilized, I mean, the UK alone mobilized more money in 3 or 4 months on the pandemic than the world is able to mobilize to alleviate poverty in a year, And so when emergencies happen, the pandemic was a good reminder of just how powerful the modern state is and can be. That's a 20th century invention. The state until the 20th century was never as big and as economically present as it has been since, and its power was on show in the pandemic. And the fact is that the modification of the landscape that water issues demand, if we continue down the path of the modernist path that we embarked on in the 20th century, the degree of sovereignty, the degree of power that you need is similar, right? That's in the early part of the 20th century, a similar effort in scale, in scope, replumbed the landscape. It was, I mean, you can think of it as an equivalent sort of effort from the point of view of state. And so I think the other thing the pandemic revealed is just that kind of large scale interventions, sovereign interventions are still possible, and they still mobilize enormous amounts of resources. And I would argue that we are on the verge of having to do something like that for our water environments, not just in the United States and Europe, but certainly across the world. I'm not advocating for it or against it. I'm just saying, note how big it is. Look at the pandemic. That's a good archetype for the kind of state intervention that you might need if you're facing severe water insecurity. And think about what you want the boundaries of that power to be, and where do you want those powers, where do you want the boundaries to fall, right? And I'm not, again, the book doesn't advocate a particular position, but it says we should be talking about it.
Mm-hmm. And then as we wrap up, I do want to remind viewers out there, you can get Water Biography at tattercover.com. You can follow us on social media. Giulio, where can we find you on the internet? Where's the best way to connect with you?
Well, you can come to my website, which is www.giulioboccaletti.com, my long Italian name, but was one thing. Or you can follow me on Twitter at G_Boccaletti. And I'm of a generation that is not native to social media, but I'm trying my best to to improve.
Yes, I will tell you, I wish I wasn't as active or as needy for social media myself. It is a great place, but also the worst place.
That's right. That's right.
Well, thank you for answering my very basic questions. As someone who doesn't understand this, you explaining it makes it make sense.
I'm glad. Thank you for entertaining.
And thank you so much again for hopping on at midnight your time. And everyone out there, thank you for viewing this. We'll email this YouTube link to you. It'll be live on our YouTube in the future. Giulio, thank you so much for a great conversation. Thank you again for doing this and rescheduling with us because of a time error on my end.
Pleasure. Thank you, Adam.
Cool. We are not live.